This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa Noble. Paresa, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So another great episode today. We have a couple of exciting guests. First of all, we're going to have Dave Beldyk from Third Stage Consulting. He'll be on the show today talking about an ERP recovery, a project that had gone off track, and client hired us to help recover that project and get it back on track. So he's going to be talking about some of those lessons learned. I'm going to ask him a bunch of questions about that scenario and that situation and what some of the takeaways are. And then we're also going to have later in the show LaCarrubba and Kameron Carpenter, also from the Third Stage team. We're going to be talking about process management. They're going to have a discussion about what is process management, how to incorporate it into your digital transformation or ERP project. And so that'll be a good hands-on discussion for those of you that are going through a transformation, trying to figure out how to deal with the operational side of your processes. So look forward to that as well. And before we get to the guests, though, Paresa, I noticed both you and I are working from home today, as many of us often are. And how is that working for you so far? Have you fully adjusted now that we're almost a year into the COVID situation, the work from home environment?
Yeah, I feel like there's two types of people. There's some people who thrive in the office, and there's some people who thrive kind of like working wherever. I'm definitely the latter. I feel like I get more done when I'm working from home just because I'm a kind of, a chatty Cathy over here. I'll talk to the people around me in the office and get easily distracted, whereas when I'm at home, I'm kind of, in my office, getting work done, banging out the project. So for me, it's been going great. I know that for some of my friends, they have had a different experience, and it was more of an adjustment for them. But yeah, over here, I have no complaints. I'm actually enjoying it. How about you?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, for times like this where we're recording podcasts or whatnot, it can be a little challenging with dogs in the background, which I have here, and kids working from home or doing school from home. But yeah, you kind of get used to it just like the rest of the world. It's interesting because I feel like you get to know people a little bit better when you see them in their homes and you see their dog or cat or kids in the background or their spouse walking by or whatever. So it's a little bit more personal in some ways. So I kind of enjoy the humanity of it and the imperfection of it all. I think it makes us all a little more real in that way. So that makes it fun.
I agree. No, but you're right. It is hard. I have a 2.5-year-old and he is a rambunctious fellow. So juggling that definitely poses a challenge sometimes, especially when you're on calls. But between my husband and I, we figured it out. We have some childcare help. So I feel like everybody's kind of figured it out. And I think, at the beginning in, March, April 2020, when this all happened, everybody was like running around like chickens with their heads cut off with their toddlers on the Zoom calls and they're, having all the challenges. But I feel like we're at a point of adapting, and it seems like, based on recent news, some of these companies, these bigger companies, are really getting acclimated to it and adopting this whole remote workforce concept permanently. Spotify actually recently announced that their whole staff can work from anywhere forever. I mean, they're not ever going to go back into the office, and there's a couple other, Zillow, I know Salesforce, Slack. We talked about that on previous episodes with Salesforce and Slack, but it's just interesting to see the absolute pivot that some of these companies are making and just embracing the new age.
Yeah. It is a question I have is, will we ever return back to the days of going to the office Monday through Friday? Being in consulting, we never really had that model to begin with. We had a pretty flexible model, but most industries, most office workers didn't have that luxury. So it's interesting to see some of these big companies. I wonder, I do wonder. I mean, first of all, there's a financial implication. So they're saving money by not necessarily having the big office footprint that they might have had in the past. But I wonder, how to find that balance between, the flexibility and the work-life balance that everyone's striving for, but not losing that collaboration and the culture that you're trying to build as an organization. And that latter part is really hard to do when you're 100% remote. We have technologies like Zoom or Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever that can help with collaboration, but that only gets you so far. It's just not the same as being in person, and it is hard to build a culture in that way. So I'll be curious to see how companies adjust to that, where the pendulum lands on the whole spectrum of 100% work from home versus 100% work in the office.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, if you were in the office, you could just kind of turn around and ask your coworker a question, whereas now, you have to ping them or shoot them an email. And I think, kind of going back to the Salesforce Slack acquisition, that's kind of what Salesforce was going for, was opening up a kind of a new channel of communication for employees to correspond a little easier, right? So they kind of still grasp it, but is it the same? I don't know. It's not that face-to-face interaction, so it's kind of up in the air. But I agree, it's kind of that trade-off, because I feel like mental health of employees, if you have the option to go work on the beach and do, as long as you're getting work done, but you're somewhere else, I feel like that's going to help with the mental health, which you could argue would drive production. But then on the other side, would those act as distractions? So I feel like it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it's very, very true. And you also think about some of the nuances of, for example, when we do digital transformations, obviously most of it's remote now, although we are starting to see more and more clients that are slowly returning back to the office. And in some parts of the world or some countries we're doing business in, they're kind of back to normal and just full on, back to the office. So it's interesting how different parts of the world are adjusting a little bit differently. But when we do these digital transformations and the workshops that go along with it and some of the deep dives into operations and things like that, it's been really interesting to see, how effective we can be remotely by doing the stuff that we typically do, in person. But it's also, a reminder that you still miss out on stuff. I mean, there's still little things, little nuances you miss about, getting to know a client, their operations, the culture, just getting to know people on a personal level, just having little sidebar conversations that you can't really have on a Zoom call with 50 other people on the line. So it's just little things like that. I think little nuances that are important, not just for organizations in general, but also for digital transformations and people that are going through the process.
Absolutely. And I will say one solution to that, I don't know if it would totally fill the need, because there's just something about that face-to-face dynamic, but there's different ways that you can engage your clients, your partners, your employees through virtual events. There are such thing as virtual wine tastings, virtual cooking classes, virtual dinner parties, etc., that you could tap into, that oftentimes are on a national and sometimes an international scale. So, it's kind of, if this is the new normal, then we have to find the new normal of the other components that play into what we once had. It's just a matter of adapting, and in this age, it's all about technology, right?
Right. No, it's very, very true. And then, some of these transformations that are midstream too, another thing we'll be curious to see is how organizations adjust. Will they, this is more of a question, I don't have a good answer to it, but, will they start bringing people to a central war room, like we would typically do in the past, where you've got a big conference room where you're in there testing systems or doing workshops on business processes and blueprints or whatever. So that'll be an interesting nuance to see how companies respond to that in their transformation efforts too.
Right. Well, I'm curious to hear about this client that kind of dropped the ball and then came to you guys, and you guys are helping them kind of pick up the pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, the missteps that this client had in this first case study we're going to get to in a second had nothing to do with the fact that it was in a COVID environment and remote workforce or remote collaboration. That was the least of the problems with this situation. So it will be interesting to dive in. So We'll take a quick break. And before we do, speaking of Spotify, you can listen to this podcast on Spotify, among other places, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. And you can also watch us every Wednesday on YouTube at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. London, and 11 p.m. Hong Kong. So be sure to check us out there, subscribe to us on YouTube and or the podcast platforms. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with Dave Beldyk, and we're going to talk about a SAP project gone wrong and gone off the rails and what we did to help get it back on track. So we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, your home for all things digital and business transformation. I'm excited to have our next guest on the show. Dave Beldyk is a senior manager at Third Stage Consulting. He's been with us for a while now and someone that we've known in the industry for some time. And he's actually someone who's done quite a bit in the way of SAP implementations. Most of his ERP background has been with larger organizations doing primarily SAP implementations, although he has some experience with other systems as well. But the case study we're going to talk about today was a client that had hired us to come in and recover or help recover a SAP implementation that had gone wrong. It went off the tracks, off the rails for a number of reasons. We're going to talk about some of those reasons here with Dave, and we're also going to, more importantly, find out what are the root causes of those challenges that they were facing, and most importantly, what did we do to recommend to help get things back on track, and what do we do to help the client get this project back on track. And this is a common dynamic we see a lot in the industry where companies will go down a path. They'll start with a transformation, run into a bunch of pitfalls and obstacles, and suddenly lose control of the project. So hopefully some of these lessons will be takeaways that you can take to your transformation to hopefully not have to deal with this sort of situation. Or if you're in the middle of the transformation and you're experiencing similar problems or issues, hopefully we'll have some good takeaways for you here today. So with that introduction, Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
So we have this client that you and I have worked with here in recent months, and they had gone down the path of trying to implement SAP. They get to a certain point where they felt like the project was off track and they ran into a number of challenges. Long story short, they call us and say, hey, can you come help fix this and help us get this project back on track? So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions around how it got off track and what some of the lessons were, and what ultimately we did to recommend to help them get back on track. But before I do that, maybe just give us a quick overview of the organization and a little bit of understanding of the size and scope and complexity of the organization. We can't mention them by name because of client confidentiality, but maybe just give us a little bit of background about the client in general.
Yeah, they're a major distributor of specialty chemicals and what I'll call related supplies. They're about $1 billion business, and they've got over 40 sites, most of them in the U.S. and Canada. They have over 40,000 SKUs that they sell. So it's quite a mix. They've got quite a variety of products they do. I mean, they have bottles and cans and drums and boxes and roll goods and sheets, and so it's quite a broad mix of things. But they basically get supplied by over like 600 or so manufacturers. So their whole thing is they're kind of the one-stop shop for their customers. So they don't have to go to 600 folks. They go to one stop and they supply them. So being really good at the logistics and the warehousing part is really their key thing, is being able to do that really well.
So the high volume distribution model with cost efficiency and minimizing cost, that's sort of their model, right?
Absolutely. And they do everything from supplying the mom and pop guys to some of the big names out there. So it's all over the board in terms of size of orders and frequency and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned one thing already that is sort of I wouldn't say it's a red flag, but something that, as consultants, we would kind of want to hone in on right away, which is that, they make chemicals, and anytime you have a process manufacturer or a product like that's process based, where it's not a discrete widget that you're just putting two things together and you end up with one. This, you're talking about converting units of measure and getting ingredients that you then have to convert into barrels and gallons and different things like that. And that tends
Exactly. That's right. So it's not just kilograms versus pounds. You got the whole gallons versus liters versus pounds versus sometimes square feet and square meters. All that stuff going on. That's true.
Yeah. So we'll dig into that a little bit more, because that technically or typically creates a lot of challenge for these sorts of implementations, as you well know with your background. But before we get to that, when they first reached out to us, they're already midstream in the project. They had already selected SAP. They knew they were going down this path. They got to a certain point and felt enough pain that they felt the need to make some changes and to ultimately reach out to us and have us come in and assess and help give some recommendations of how to get the project back on track. What were some of the early signs that they had when we first engaged with them that they knew that things were off track?
Yeah. Well, really, the very first sign that things were in trouble were something we didn't hear a whole lot about, because they had some internal issues, I would say, between some of their leadership and the system integrator. And ultimately, they ended up kicking out the system integrator. And then it was a few months later that one of the members of leadership actually left too. So we'll never know that whole story. Obviously, there was trouble in paradise, so that was kind of a red flag to begin with. But when it really became obvious to everybody that there was trouble was kind of after the first go live. There were things they were trying to implement that seemed to test out pretty well in the classroom setting, but when they took it to real life, it didn't work so well. Had a lot of troubles with that, and so that was one of the problems. It took much longer to stabilize than they thought. And they had a total of, they're going to do like 5 rollouts. So, you know how these things go. You got to move on to the next one while one's stabilizing. And when they tried to do that, their whole concept was they had the notion of doing a global build. So they didn't expect a lot of build activities between the first and second rollout. But as it turned out, they had a few missed requirements. So they had much more build activities than they thought. So that kind of caused 2 kind of things. One, it threw a kink in their schedule from a build standpoint. But then you got these poor guys that are trying to stabilize the first rollout while folks are changing the system in the middle after they're doing that. So they ended up having to do a lot of regression testing that they had not planned for. So that was really when they really raised their hand and say, we're in trouble and we need another set of eyes on this thing to make sure we're not driving this thing right in the ditch.
Yeah. And, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, they actually caught the problem sooner than a lot of clients we work with. A lot of clients get a lot further along before they finally realize, wow, we're really in trouble here and we need some help. So they at least caught it relatively early. I mean, you never want to see anyone have to go down that path, but at least they caught it semi-early. What are some examples of, I'm intrigued by the comment you made early in your response there about how the stuff in the classroom didn't convert to reality or production. What are some examples, and what do you think caused that? I mean, was it?
This is actually this is a good example because it's a classic one that we see again and again. They were trying to implement. Well, let me back up a minute. Most of the time in their legacy system, they were used to using FIFO, first in, first out. And I say most of the time because they did what I call quasi FIFO, and which basically means they did it when it was convenient. But now they wanted to take that extra step and kind of hard code it, so to speak, hardwired into the system, make the ERP system force them to do FIFO, first in, first out. Well, when it's sort of loosey goosey, kind of semi quasi FIFO, when you get to that point where the system's telling you, pick this drum that's way in the back, way in the bottom, and you got to move 8 things out of the way. when it's a quasi FIFO, you sort of can, hand wave and say, well, we'll just pick another one. We'll replace that. So, you might have had to pick 10 pallets and 9 of them are meet the FIFO requirement. The last one didn't. But as soon as you say, I'm going to force it from my ERP system, then guess what? You can't wave your hand anymore. You got to go get that drum. You got to get that one, and you got to move those 8 things and get them out of the way. And if you have that happen on every order or every other order, suddenly your smooth, efficient operations just grind to a halt. And they underestimated that. They did not anticipate that. The functionality worked as planned. I mean, it said, this is the oldest one, go get it. They just didn't realize what go get it meant. So that was one problem. The other problem, which is related to that, is they're working in these little handheld devices. So if you've seen those, they got little tiny screens. You don't have a lot of real estate in those screens. So in the old days, when it said, go pick 40 batches, 40 pallets of material XYZ, you didn't need a lot of real estate. You just start finding material XYZ and scanning. But when it says, no, go pick these 40 pallets, now suddenly you've got to go scanning through all these screens. And what used to take them 1, 2, or 3 screens to get through, now they were flipping through 20, 30, 40 screens to get through that. So they ended up actually having to kind of rework that whole design of how they did their handhelds. So these are all things that in the classroom it looks great, but when you get out in the real world, they didn't mimic the real world very well when they did their testing, and they found out, unfortunately, at go live that this was not going to work out so well, and that's obviously a bad time to find out that it's not going so well.
Yeah, and just to maybe jump ahead to kind of solutions or lessons from those couple examples you gave, particularly the classroom setting not reflecting reality. What, if you could, having watched the game film, you kind of saw what they did and how it ended up, you go back in time, what would you have done different? I mean, would you have suggested just more robust scenarios that they test, or what are your thoughts on how do you fix that?
Exactly. I think, what I always like to see is that real well-defined scenarios, that the kind of real day in the life, what's it really going to be like, involve the people that really do it. If you can do it in the area that's really going to take place. Anytime you have to put your hands on product and materials and move them around and that sort of thing, it's good to be out where all that happens. If you're taking an order and you're doing business planning type activities, you can kind of do that remotely. That's not the same as, when you're on the shop floor and there's physical real world implications that you need to take into account. So I always like to, do the scenarios for real. If you have to pick 100 item order, pick 100 item order, test it, see what that's really like. Don't just say we pick 1 or 2. It's not rinse and repeat 100 times. That doesn't get it. You got to really see what it takes to do that. So I definitely say, you try to do that kind of thing. The other thing that when you think about it too holistically like that, you realize that these picking strategies, it's not just about the picking strategy anymore. The way I put it away has a big impact on my ability to go pick it. So now you got to think through the put away strategies, and that starts to, then the pieces start to all come together. So when you really, when you do your testing, make sure you do the end-to-end testing, from the time you receive it to the vendor to put it away, and then you go back and retrieve it to make sure that you've kind of got the whole end-to-end things. Because if you look at things in isolation, sometimes it looks okay, feels okay, but when you put it all together, sometimes not so much.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it raises another question. While we're going down this thread, is what in the testing that was done, or in the classroom training and the testing that was done up front, what were the right people involved? In other words, were there people that were sort of working on the front lines that you would have expected would have picked up on these nuances or these disconnects between what they were seeing in the classroom versus the way things would actually work? Or did they not involve the right people? Or what do you think the reason why some of that wasn't captured or caught earlier?
Yeah, I think they involved a lot of the folks that were kind of managing the area. not necessarily the guys with the actually running around picking the stuff. They're too busy out there picking, right? So they had some other people doing the testing, and they verified that the functionality worked, but they had that disconnect between the physical world and the system world, and they just didn't know, they didn't realize. And like I said, they had always thought that we do almost FIFO almost all the time, but there's a big gap between almost all the time and 100% of the time. And they just didn't realize how big a leap it was. And so, yeah, they didn't involve all the right people, nor did they bring the physical world into play. I think that's one of the things that and it's common. Most people don't do this in the physical world. The testing, a lot of it is classroom. But if, like I said, when you actually have to put your hands on product and move it and touch it and feel it, where that label is physically, and can you get to it and read it and scan it, that matters. And so unless you've got folks that really know it inside and out, sometimes it's best to say, we're going to do this testing in the warehouse. We're going to go out there. We're going to scan. We're going to put our hands on it. We're going to put it on a fork truck and move it around. And when you start doing that, that's when you find, we might have to reconfigure our warehouse a little bit. And when I say reconfigure, I mean in a physical way, not in a system way, but the things that you used to put, when you start stack things up, suddenly you realize maybe I should do this differently. Maybe I shouldn't be stacking these things up because it creates a pain in the butt for me when I have to go back and get them. So helping to get that physical real world, however you do it, that's what you kind of got to get that notion in there as best you can.
Yeah. Getting the right people in the right real world scenarios laid out. It sounds like that's something that was missing there.
Yeah.
So you've already touched on this a little bit, but I'll ask it anyway to see if we've missed anything so far. But when we think about some of the biggest challenges that this client was facing and some of the biggest pains they were facing as they were going through the transformation before we got involved, what were the biggest challenges beyond what we've already talked about? Were there other things that they really were struggling with along the way?
Well, you did mention the one thing early on was some of the unit of measure stuff. That is challenged for a lot of people, especially with in the SAP world. We all know SAP is very rigid in some things that they do. A unit of measure is certainly one of the things where there are challenges, and they have a lot of variable weight product. And the way they were trying to deal with that, it caused a lot of issues, because if you wanted to go pick 5 drums, but they were all different weights, you couldn't really pick them by the drum. You had to kind of pick it by the weight. And if you didn't, and so that it created a whole number of issues that they really didn't have in their legacy system. And the way they define their badges and all that stuff comes into play, and what kind of options you have and how you can define your units of measure. And so they made some decisions early on without understanding the implications of what that would mean, what doors it would close and what doors it would open. And when they did that, they found themselves having to do some custom stuff to get around some of the early decisions we made. What we ultimately ended up doing was kind of walking them through. We started like from a blank sheet of paper and talked through some of the strategies that you could do to deal with these issues and really solve them at a root cause level. But ultimately they ended up deciding that to do it right, if they were going to do it from the very beginning, they would have defined their badges at a different level, and that would have allowed them to use, not to get too deep into details, but badge specific units of measure, and which would allow them to pick exactly a drum, even if it's different weights. All those things could have worked, but the way they defined their badges were the way was at the level that the vendor defined the badge, which was 40 drums is one batch. And so when you're trying to pick from there, now you can't use the full functionality that SAP has. So long story short, probably too late for that. What they had to do was some custom activities to deal with that. They wish they had done the other thing, but it was too much to undo to get there now. So, it would have been good if we could have had them from the very beginning and had that conversation day one. It would have saved a lot of time and pain. But at least they understood what was going on, and now they could make a good decision. They knew they were between a rock and a hard place, and now it was either unravel what they had done, or do this custom work to work around it. And they decided to do the custom work to work around it. And for where they were at the time, that was the right decision. If they've been talking about it 8 months ago, it would have been a different thing, I think.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. It's always nice to have the benefit of hindsight, but there's a lot of lessons here I think that others could take away and maybe apply earlier in the process to not necessarily have to make the mistakes themselves.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go the direction you're starting to go, which is more the kind of the solutions. What are the answers to these problems, and what are the recommendations we ultimately made, and what are some of the lessons we can take away from this for other organizations that might be struggling with the same thing, or might be on the verge of heading down a similar path as this client. So we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. We're here with Dave Beldyk talking about a SAP transformation gone wrong and what we did to help correct it. We'll be right back after a quick break.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Dave Beldyk, talking about a SAP transformation case study, and more specifically, a troubled SAP implementation case study. And before the break, Dave, we were talking about some of the challenges that this company and this client faced, some of the nuances of the mistakes they made, and some of the areas they stumbled, and some of the pitfalls they ran into. But shifting gears a little bit and looking to, what could they do given where they were at that point in the process? Mm-hmm. What were some of those recommendations we made? What was some of that low-hanging fruit as far as the handful of things that we recommended to them that would have the biggest impact on their transformation? What were some of those things that we recommended in the process?
Yeah, well, right when we came in, as I mentioned, they were kind of in between go lives and they were getting ready for the next go live. And so we really, at that point, we kind of looked at it and said, okay, you've been burned. You kind of know what things are happening here. You kind of know how the functionality works and how it has to kind of connect with the physical world to make it all work. So you make sure that you learn from that experience and make sure you do testing of real life scenarios, full detailed real life scenarios. Take a look at your current warehouses that you're getting ready to go live in, and make sure that you've got the right people involved doing the testing. Even take a look at where your inventory is situated, because when you're right now, like if you were to flip the switch to go live today, if you knew you had some of the oldest materials tucked way in the back, way underneath a whole bunch of stuff, those are going to be problematic, especially if those are high volume materials that you're going to be using the very first week. You're going to have to go get those things. You could actually think ahead and do a little bit of rearranging of that stuff to basically unpile some of those things now, so that you're not facing that at go live. So they're a little bit smarter. They knew what was coming, but it was about making sure that they did a lot more realistic testing and with the right people, and then looking at it compared to their real inventory and where it was configured. And I think they even made a few changes in the warehouse to, put things in different aisles or different places to make it a little bit more accessible. I think thinking ahead like that is one of the big recommendations we did early on.
Yeah. And they had it's always a little bit easier as a consultant when you have a client who has made some mistakes on their own and they kind of know what not to do. And a lot of times
Right.
it's one thing to tell a client, hey, don't go stub your toe. But once they've stubbed their toe, then they feel the pain and they understand more fully, what you mean.
Don't do that again. That's right.
Right. It's like kids with a hot stove, don't touch the oven, and then they touch the oven, and then they know not to touch the oven.
That's right.
But one question I have, a nuance in this is, not every organization that goes through this necessarily has, multiple locations or multiple phases to where they could take those lessons from, phase one or go live number one and apply it to the next go live. What about this situation where either company doesn't have that luxury for whatever reason, or they're already in the thick of it. They've already gone live and realized, oops, we didn't test this stuff. The classroom stuff isn't translating into the operational real world. What do you do in those cases? Or what did these guys do? Did they just kind of power through and say, we're going to make this work? Or did they back up and say, let's rethink or redo what we just went live with?
Yeah. Actually, in their case, it was a little bit of both. They knew it was always an option to not force FIFO by the ERP system. They didn't have to do that. They wanted to do that. And they decided that, no, we're committed to that. We're going to make that happen. We're going to work through this and stick with that decision. They could have backed off of that. And that's still a card they can play if they really run into big trouble in the future. But I think they're pretty committed to that. So I give them credit for that. They knew it. They now understood exactly what that meant, and they were ready to deal with it. On the other hand, we talked about some of the scanning stuff. That's where they said, you know what, this is not going to work, and we're going to have to make some technical changes. And I mentioned before with some of the unit of measure stuff, they had to make some technical things, some custom activities to, some custom design to be able to deal with that sort of thing. So, like I said, it was a little bit of both, kind of a mixed bag, but that's kind of how they dealt with it.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's it's interesting to see how different companies respond to those sorts of challenges. Some will just say, well, I guess we're just going to live with it and live in the suboptimal world that we've imposed on ourselves. But in this case, being a high volume distribution company where throughput is so important, they didn't, that really wasn't a good option for them. It doesn't sound like.
No, right. They had delayed their project. They kind of put it on hold, and they were kind of looking at, when should we go live next, and what should the overall schedule look like? So we were dealing with the immediate go live right in front of them, which they still wanted to proceed with. But then we also took a look at what remained, the remaining rollouts, and did it make sense, how they had laid those out, and did they have enough time between? And they kind of did. They had a little bit of, they had a process that they were trying to do where they rolled out at a consistent, basically a 5-month cycle, kind of thing, where they had a repeatable cycle for rollout, which is a good thing, because people understand what's coming. But what they struggled with a little bit was, first of all, the rollouts that they had laid out. It's like they had 5 regions defined, so they said we'll do 5 rollouts. Well, when you started looking at the size of each of those things, it really didn't make sense to do that, because some of the rollouts, quite frankly, were too small, and some were huge, and so they weren't, to use the same kind of rollout schedule for each of them just didn't make sense. It really ended up, I think it cost a lot more. In a desire to have something repeatable, they kind of forgot to take into account the scope of what they were doing. And so it really made more sense to group things. We actually came up with a plan that instead of doing 5 rollouts, let's do 4 rollouts, give us a little bit more time between the rollouts, 2 in particular. And then the size of the rollouts tended to match a little bit more likely. And then it made more sense, and it seemed to work better. And at the end of the day, it got them done, the overall project, at the same time. But that would reduce a little bit of risk. So it's always a balancing act between how many rollouts do you do, and you can slice it up and do 20 rollouts. Well, nobody wants to do that. Or I can do one big bang. Well, that's a little dicey too. So somewhere in between, and kind of navigating those waters a little bit, figuring out what the sweet spot is. We kind of helped them with that a little bit. So.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that there's, no easy answer to any of these decisions. Even the recommendations we made to this client, I suspect there are still some significant risks that needed to be dealt with that recommendation.
Yeah.
If there was an easy answer or a easy button or a silver bullet, I think we'd have a lot more successes in the industry than we have right now.
Yeah. It's all trade-offs. Right?
Yep. Now, what about someone who's about to start a project like this? Backing up a little bit, and they haven't stubbed their toe yet. What are some of the recommendations that you would make to a similar type of organization that's about to implement SAP or any other sort of enterprise technology for that matter? What would you tell them?
Yeah. Well, certainly, I think it is important to pick a system integrator that you do have a good cultural fit with. I'm not saying that's at the top of the list of your priorities, but it's pretty darn important. You're gonna partner with the system integrator for months, if not years. So it's very important that you get along together, and so that goes, that's absolutely critical. The other thing I think in this case, if you're going to do a global build, and oh, by the way, I do like that idea. I do like the notion of doing a global build because it kind of helps upfront what you're dealing with. So if you're going to do a global build, which means gather global requirements, which means engaging people globally early on in the project to make sure you've got their input early on. Now, it's okay to say, you gather requirements and you identify some build activity that you're going to do. I'm going to delay that for 6 months and do it later. That's fine. There's no problem with that. The problem is if you get 6 months down the road, getting ready to go live and do your next thing, and now you have a requirement that you hadn't identified, and suddenly it is a big requirement. It takes a big build. Now you've thrown your schedule into a mess, and you start getting into I got to cut short on the documentation, or I got to cut short on the testing, and you get in trouble there. So if you're going to do a global build, then take it to heart and do it the right way.
Right.
And then the final thing, and I'll say this to anyone who's doing any kind of implementation: do as realistic scenarios as you can when you're doing the testing. Far better to find out that you've got a problem in the testing phase than at go live. So test it. I mean, really strain it. Really try to break it. And that's kind of the best advice I can give.
Yeah, and think through those exceptions. They may not seem like a huge deal, or it may not be a majority of your processes or your normal circumstances, but those are the things, like you mentioned early on, those are the things that can throw a monkey wrench into your entire operations. Even if it's a small thing, or even if it's an exception, that can build up and create a lot of problems.
Yeah. And I think the thing that really caught them by surprise is they felt like they were already doing this FIFO most of the way. They just didn't realize how big a leap it was from most of the way to all of the way. It was a big thing.
Yeah. Now, what about an organization who may already be in the middle of their journey and they're experiencing some sort of challenges, maybe at this magnitude that this client faced, or maybe even greater? What would you recommend to that sort of organization or someone in that situation?
Well, I think the one thing that they did do good, I'll give them credit for, is calling a bit of a timeout and having somebody with an independent view of this to take a look at it and say, are we in trouble or aren't we? And if we are, what do we do? What are our options? I think that was an important thing to do. And I think getting a lot of what we talked about, they sort of knew. They just needed to hear it. They needed to know that what they were doing was the right thing. They had some pretty good plans. I think they realized they'd let it get a little bit out of control. And so even though they had some things they wanted to do, I'd say probably 80% of what they wanted to do, we felt was the right thing. We gave a few suggestions that would be helpful. And I think that was kind of, helpful for them. But I think that when you get into a situation like that, having the ability to do that and call that timeout is important. They could have called a longer timeout. We could have unraveled some of that design and going back to basics and probably dealt with some things. I think that's one of those things where it gets tough because you've committed a lot of time and money to get to a certain point. And when you finally realize, just like you said, the 20/20 hindsight, At some point you get to a point where there is no return, and you either plow forward with what you got, maybe make a few tweaks, or you just say, you know what, we're stopping, and we're not doing it. We're not going further until we figure out how we're going to land this thing, because there is no sense moving forward with something you don't think you can land. I mean, you've said it many times. I mean, the amount of time and effort and money that's spent trying to land the failed implementation, it can devastate a company. So you can't let yourself go there. So it's far better to cause a pause and figure it out than to keep plowing forward. I think that's a key thing.
Yeah, that's great advice, especially because, it's always fascinating to me how many organizations are afraid to do that. They feel like, well, I've got a big system integrator here telling me that everything's fine and that it's going to be too disruptive if we pause their resources, or they might have to switch their resources or go staff them somewhere else, and therefore we shouldn't do it. I mean, you look at some of the dollars that are being spent on not just system integrators, but just the burn rate of the project in general. You want to dial it in and get it right, and if it means calling a timeout or calling an audible or changing course, then, it's your project. Go ahead and do it. I think it's fascinating to me how companies are so afraid to manage more carefully how they spend their time and money and focus on these projects just because someone else is telling them, don't worry about it.
Right. It's true.
Yeah. So good advice. Take control of your project and call the timeout, bring in help if you need it. And I think that's good closing advice. Well, thanks for being here, Dave. Really appreciate the discussion and the time and the lessons learned. This was really, really interesting.
Okay, great. Good talking to you, Eric.
All right, good chatting with you too. And we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more on transformation ground control. We'll be right back.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
All right, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm Eric Kimberling here with Paresa. Be sure to follow us on social media. Follow Third Stage or myself, Eric Kimberling, on LinkedIn. That's where we're most active. You can also find us both on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So, Paresa, we had this conversation with Dave about the SAP digital transformation gone wrong and how it got right again. What were some of the observations you had from the discussion?
Yeah, well, a lot of the problem seems like it happened in the testing phase, which is interesting because, you think when you're testing, you're going to be in the clear of any trouble if you pass the test. But if your tests aren't mirroring that reality of the situation, obviously it's not going to work as you intended it to work. And one thing that Dave specifically said was make sure to do end-to-end testing. So it might be an amateur hour question, but I do hope to kind of dissect that. How would you explain end-to-end testing in layman's terms?
Sure. So that's where you have a couple different types of testing. You have the technical testing, the unit testing is what developers or software people usually call it, where you're testing a certain function in a system. Like I want to create a purchase order. And so they'll test that one little piece of the software. And then another one might be approval of a purchase order or approval of an invoice. And you're testing each of those things individually as you configure it. And if you do customization or any code behind it, you're testing those individual pieces. End-to-end testing is when you put it all together and you say, okay, now we're going to take a whole workflow from start to finish, from the time a customer places an order, or even before then, a potential customer becomes a prospect. How do we sell to them? How do we provide estimates or bids to them? How do we close the deal or create an order? How does it flow through the entire process? So it's meant to draw out defects or issues or challenges or things that need to be addressed in the processes and workflows. And, you know, on one hand, it's common to run into challenges. That's why you do end-to-end testing, because you want to work out the kinks in a non-real life environment, so to speak, where the stakes are lower. You're not screwing up a customer order for real. You're testing it, and you're screwing it up in a test environment. So you want to, on one hand, you want to break as much as you can during that end-to-end testing. But on the other hand, a lot of organizations find that they haven't done enough of the legwork up front, and now when you get to end-to-end testing, that's when everything falls apart, because you realize that this is more than just fixing some minor wrinkles here and there. This is a mass problem that we have, and that's a sign typically of mismanagement of the project earlier on, because you should have wrinkles you're working out again, but you don't want to have a massive problem where it's a showstopper where this just isn't going to work at all. If you've gotten to that point in end-to-end testing, that's a problem. So back to your question, that end-to-end testing is more of it's both technical in nature in terms of you're trying to find kinks in the system, but you're also trying to find kinks in the operational alignment with the technology. So in other words, is this going to work from a business perspective? And oftentimes clients or consultants will refer to that as conference room pilots, which is another form of end-to-end testing where it's more focused on the business workflows, not just the technology.
I see. Okay. So it's just kind of getting a full scope of what the new technology will do rather than testing pieces.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. The technology and the processes. It's also making sure that we've defined what's Paresa going to do in this workflow. What am I going to do? What's that handoff look like when I pass something back to you in the system or whatever? It's meant to not only work out the technical kinks, but also the operational and organizational kinks as well.
That makes sense. And then the other thing that Dave mentioned is that it sounded like there was more so the managers who were testing, and maybe it wasn't exactly the right people who were doing the testing, like the people who would actually be utilizing the software day to day, kind of like working on the front line. So I guess my question to you, and we've touched on this before, but what is an ideal project team? I mean, in an ideal world, would you have one large team working on the group, and then within that team, it branches off into like the steering committee, the OCM team, the testing team, etc. Have you seen that happen, or what's the best practice as far as how to build your project team?
Yeah, so generally you'd have, you mentioned a couple of them. Steering committee would be the executive steering committee, which is, your executive team, and they're the ones that everything, they're kind of the point where the buck stops there. I mean, any major decisions that need to be made or any major issues that need to be worked through, they're more strategic in nature. Generally, that's what they're for, is to provide that point of escalation, as well as obviously, keeping them informed of what the changes are, the impact of the organization, and making sure the team stays aligned at the executive level. Then you usually have a project manager, a project lead, or program manager, I should say, who manages, all the internal resources, the system integrator, the other third parties, the change management team. All the stuff reports up to the program manager. And then below that, you typically would have the core project team, which is usually a smaller group of, it depends on the size of the organization, the size of the team, but a lot of times it'll be, 7 to 10 people. They're part of this core team where they're the core, they're the continuity through the project as far as defining big picture operational workflows and organizational impacts, or helping identify organizational impacts, and they sort of own the change, if you will. But then below that, you'd have a series of subject matter experts that you draw in as needed. So that's where you get a lot more people involved potentially, and you go deeper into certain areas as you get into accounts payable or accounts receivable or procurement or whatever the case may be. You'll bring in subject matter experts for some of the different sub-processes, and their job is usually to provide the subject matter knowledge so that we can build a workflow and a technology to support the new business processes. But they're also the ones that would be involved in the end-to-end testing or the conference room pilots that we were talking about a minute ago. They'd be the ones oftentimes that would help with the training, so going out and helping train the other people. They end up being sort of the super users or people that are experts in the system. So there's a whole nother layer of subject matter experts that can provide additional involvement and knowledge to the process as well.
That makes sense. I mean, this is especially for larger companies where they're doing a total uphaul of their systems. I mean, being more collaborative sounds like the right thing to do, but then also you don't want to get too many people involved, because then it's almost like you're diluting the process. So, okay, at a high level, to test things correctly, because this sounded like the biggest issue that they ran into. Make sure you do end-to-end testing, and make sure you have the right people who are testing. Do you have any other best practices that you'd share when it comes to testing your software before go live?
Yeah, I would actually bring it further upstream, even way before the actual testing, because like I said, the testing oftentimes will expose, call it the normal kinks that need to be worked out, but then oftentimes it exposes big problems you should have worked out a lot earlier. And so the question becomes, how do we take some of that stuff off the table or deal with that stuff earlier? Because by the time you get to testing, usually it's later in the project, and it's harder to get it back on track by the time you get to testing. It's kind of like same thing with training. A lot of times when you get to training, people start to freak out, and you realize that organizationally roles aren't defined very well as far as what this is going to look like in the future, and then you're scrambling trying to figure out how we're going to clarify all this for people. In addition to training them, now we have to figure out who's doing what and how we're going to set up security in the new system to accommodate new user profiles and whatnot. So I think with end-to-end testing, we have to look at how do we get a handle on those business processes and workflows to really work out the kinks, at least conceptually early on, so that, Dave was talking about the units of measure issue that they had with converting to barrels. I think you were saying, because they're taking liquids, putting them in barrels. So that's a unit of measure conversion type of issue when you've got one barrel and you've got to determine what is one barrel equal in terms of ounces or gallons of other materials. So that's something that should have been worked through earlier. I mean, that's something that you would define in a workflow when you're modeling out how it's going to look and the design of the system. So that was a flaw. I don't know how that happened or why that happened, but something got missed that's pretty major early on. So I think that the key is to really look up front. If you take the time up front to define your processes at a high level at least, and use that as a blueprint to how you want the system integrator or the software vendor to implement the technology, usually that's going to be a lot more effective, and it's going to draw out some of these kinks early in the process. You can deal with them head on and have a better solution to deal with them rather than waiting till testing or even end user training to discover some of those.
Right. I mean, it sounds like the success of a digital transformation is honestly front loaded. It's what you do at the beginning, how you set yourself up, that will determine how you cross the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we always tell clients too that, don't just jump into an implementation once you've selected the software, the technology. Don't just jump in and start building stuff, because that's what a lot of system integrators will encourage you to do, because you think about it, that they're incentivized to get on site as quickly as possible and just start doing stuff because the meter starts running and they're busy, they're making money, all that good stuff. But as far as what you need for your business to be successful, you want to take the time up front before you ever engage or bring in the system integrator to clearly define what should this business process look like at the end of the day. We're not getting down into workflows and which buttons do we push, what screen do we go to. We're not getting down to the really granular detail, but at least have that general flow so that you can own the project and use that as a blueprint to guide and direct the system integrator to build, to meet that accordingly. And if you don't do that, then you end up building bits and pieces of the technology, and then you get to end-to-end testing and realize this doesn't fit together the way we wanted it to for our business. So that's an important takeaway as well.
Yeah, and speaking of finding the right fit, Dave specifically mentioned is one of his tips, find the right cultural fit. So I'm curious on that, because I've never thought of a technology or software as having a culture per se. So I guess, what should leaders be looking for if they want to take that tip to the bank? How do you align your company culture with the culture of a software or a software vendor?
Yeah, it's an interesting nuance. It's definitely more of an art than a science. It's hard to quantify, but it's just to give an example. It's probably the best way I could describe it, or give a couple examples. You have, for big companies, a lot of times big companies will consider SAP versus Oracle, and those are two systems that are very different. SAP is a lot more structured and rigid, and some would argue inflexible compared to Oracle. Oracle's more, it just has more flexibility. It's easier to integrate with other third-party systems. They both have pros and cons. I mean, neither one of those is right or wrong, even though some may have a strong preference, but there are definite pros and cons. So you want to look at which one of those is going to fit not only who we are today, but what we want to be. A lot of companies that have grown and scaled decide that, we're acting in too many silos, and we're acting very disparate. We're not integrated in terms of our workflows and data. So something like an SAP could help us get there. Other customers might say, well, we're trying to retain flexibility. We have all different types of customers throughout the world. We're trying to accommodate, and flexibility is our part of our model. SAP probably isn't going to fit very well there, or it could create some conflict there. That's where an Oracle might fit better. And for a smaller mid-market company, the same holds true for, say, Oracle NetSuite is, kind of the more standard, more rigid version for smaller companies. And then you've got something like an Odoo that's an open source system that you can change and do whatever you want with it. So two totally different cultural fits, if you will, but that's the kind of thing you have to look at. And you have to do it in the context of where you are today and then what you're trying to nudge the company to become in the future.
Right, future state. We talk a lot about that. Is what is your company or your organization going to look like in 5, 10, 20 years? And how can this software help you get there? That makes sense.
Yeah. So it's all part of getting the right technology up front. I think in this case the client did choose the right technology. I don't think it was necessarily a problem that SAP wasn't a good fit. That unit of measure thing is a common challenge for a lot of different companies and a lot of different systems. So if you're if you happen to be working for a company that makes food or beverage or any other sort of process manufacturing, chemicals, for example, unit of measure where you're converting something that's liquid into single units, that conversion is very difficult for a lot of systems. So you have to look at things like that. What are those big deal breakers or things that could create challenges in your operations? So some good takeaways from Dave, and we appreciate having him on the show. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to two of our consultants on our team at the third stage about business process management, and that kind of ties back to your question, Paresa, about end-to-end testing and how you resolve some of that. Some of that can be resolved through business process management, and a lot of this work should be done early as possible in the project, as I was mentioning a moment ago. And they're going to talk a little bit more specifically about how to do that. So we're going to have Brian and Kameron back on the show here in just a second. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
You're sitting all alone, are you okay?
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa Noble. Excited to have our next guest on the show. We have Brian LaCarrubba and Kameron Carpenter, who are going to chat with us about business process management, what it is, how to do it, when you should do it. And it ties pretty nicely to the conversation we just had with Dave about the ERP project gone wrong, or the digital transformation gone wrong. Business process management is one of those pieces that is often overlooked and is often a big problem for a lot of digital transformations. And so knowing how to do it, when to do it, how it ties into your overall transformation, this is a really important conversation, because a lot of the problem you see in the industry right now with system integrators and software vendors tends to gloss over this whole concept of business process management or process improvement, re-engineering, whatever you want to call it, value stream mapping. Everyone has a different name for it. But the whole idea here, the whole point is that, this is an important component to successful transformation, and it's important to do it as early as you can in the project. So without delaying the conversation, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Brian and Kameron to talk about business process management. Brian and Kameron, welcome to the show.
Hello, welcome to this Q&A discussion on business process management. My name is Kameron Carpenter. I am an associate consultant with Third Stage Consulting Group, and my experience spans multiple industries from manufacturing through architecture, engineering, construction. I did non-for-profits, professional services, working on multiple projects in the ERP, digital transformation, and change management initiatives. Here We are here. This is a video, one series of video that Third Stage has been putting out. And I have with me Brian LaCarrubba, manager for Third Stage Consulting Group. Brian, if you want to introduce yourself. Thanks, Cameron. Happy to be here, and thank you all for who are watching this video today. So just to give a little background on myself, I'm, as Cameron said, a manager at Third Stage. I started my career in the financial operations world, and I was always looking for ways to make things better and to improve the processes that we did and make them more efficient. And from there, I went into a variety of roles using process improvement techniques, and did that in a variety of settings and contexts. Sometimes they were pure business process improvement type roles. Other times they were hybrids connecting to areas like project management, business intelligence, and large software implementations. So I've been doing that for, started down that journey really over a dozen years ago. I am certified as a Six Sigma Black Belt, which many of you will be familiar with that, as well as a certified process professional. That's through the BP group, a certification that's really one kind of ruthlessly focused on the customer experience, aligning your process around what your customers need, and making sure that everything you're doing as an organization is devoted to that. So through these, I've gained a really broad-based background in process management and how it ties into what you're doing as an organization. So I'll be talking some today about ways that this can help you. Excellent. Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. And for those watching, Brian is a Visio wizard, can process map on the fly. So happy to have this discussion with you today. So let's just go ahead and jump right in and get started with this, Brian. First and foremost, what is business process management or process improvement? Sure thing, Cameron. And it's important too, people listening are going to have a variety of different degrees of exposure to this. So depending on where you're at in your journey of familiarity here, you may have heard a lot of different terms, whether it's Six Sigma or BPM, TQM, process reengineering, continuous improvement. There's a number of different methodologies and frameworks and tools out there. And they all have different areas of focus. They all have value. But for what we're going to get into today, I really want to focus more on the similarities and what they mean for your organization, and not worry too much about the distinctions of what each of those techniques are. So really the guiding principle around this, what's critical is that how your organization gets work done, that is central to your mission and to what you're trying to do. So it's your processes that are what connect your people to your customers and to your organization's goals. So managing your processes, it's about understanding what your processes are, how they're getting done, how well they're getting done. It's about aligning them to your goals, making sure that they're serving your organization the way that they need to. It's about managing the effectiveness of these processes and ensuring that the effectiveness and the efficiency, I should say, ensuring that the way your people are getting work done is really serving what you need, and that you have an eye into how that's happening. And it's about continuously monitoring and improving that. So to the extent possible, you want to be gathering data on your processes and being able to really see the health of your processes, how they're supporting what you're trying to do, and being able to focus on and improve the processes that need improvement. Excellent. Thank you for that answer. And one of the key words I just heard was continuous process improvement. So sounds like it's something that needs to continue. It should never just, we do it one time and we're done. Absolutely, Cam. Yeah, your organization's always changing, and processes that served you well at one point in time may not serve you well in the future. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be because the business has changed. It could be because you've had turnover in your people. It could be because circumstances have changed around it. Processes, I don't want to conflate process and technology at all, but technology is in so much of what we do now strongly intermingled with your processes and is a key part of it. In some cases, technology is a key driver of them. In some cases, it's an add-ons. So technology, as it's changing, also has an impact on your processes. So for a variety of reasons, things are just going to be different over time, and you can't just assume that because you got things set into a good place at one time that you're fixed for the future. That said, you may find that the degree of attention you're putting on different processes over time is different. Some may be able to go through an improvement effort and a minimal amount of monitoring to be kept successful. Others really need to be more closely watched over time.
Obviously it'd be great if you can put as much attention to all of your processes as you can over time, but just recognizing limitations and resources, you do need to have a good understanding of what are the processes you have out there, how important are they, which ones you're going to put your time and attention to and devote your resources to.
Excellent. Well, thank you for elaborating on that. And I think this would be a good time to switch gears here, and we'll maybe ask who should be involved in this business process management or process improvement.
Sure thing, Cam. So there are a variety of roles you want to get involved in this. And one of the key areas that I haven't brought up in this that's important here is the idea of cross-functional processes and looking at your processes end to end. So often you may have teams that do some work on their own processes. They may do brown bag sessions and map things out and say, this is what we need to improve, but they may not be optimizing for that end-to-end experience. So defining your processes in an end-to-end fashion is a key part of that. And so it means that when you want to undertake process efforts, you need to be able to bring in these cross-functional teams who are involved in the end-to-end process. So you don't just want to have, say, an operations team without having the sales team that's connected to it. You need to make sure that you are closely linked. And it's not to say every single session involving every process needs to touch on everyone, but you need to make sure you're really looking at where are the handoffs and processes and how do you engage the people across them. So the types of roles you're going to have in this, you'll need to have subject matter experts who have familiarity in different key areas. And you need to make sure too that these are people who know on the ground what's happening. You may have very knowledgeable managers who have a good understanding of the big picture and what's happening, but it's often true that they're disconnected from the reality of day to day what's happening in those processes. It's not to say they are by definition, but you need to be careful that you're not just assuming that someone who oversees the process actually knows how it's getting done. So in addition to those subject matter experts, you should have business process owners, people who are responsible for that end-to-end process. And a lot of organizations may have done exercises of defining and assigning business process owners, or they may not have. So that's really a key role where you need to make sure that there is a person who is accountable to the health of that process and who's going to be overseeing it over time. And the other piece you need to bring in, of course, is someone to facilitate sessions. So there are different roles that can do this, and depending on the type of effort you're getting in, you may look for people with a vast amount of experience in doing something like this, business process analysts, someone with, whether or not certifications can be a good thing. It's not just certifications that matter, and people can learn to do this. But this is a type of area where if you don't have people who have experience in this, you're going to need some help. That's an area where there's organizations like Third Stage that we can step in and help with something like this. And there are plenty of ways to get some outside help if you don't have that skill set within your organization.
The Templars and the Saracens, they're traveling in the
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Thank you for distinguishing the difference between a business process owner and subject matter expert. I know that sometimes there's confusion during sessions that there's a mix-up. And so is there anything additional that we need to show to distinguish? Like the business process owner is more so responsible for that process. Like they're going to sign it off. The subject matter expert, it could be a number of people working underneath them. In different departments, like you said. Are there anything else that we can distinguish the difference between, when you have workshop sessions, are you bringing in the business process owners with all the subject matter experts? What's that kind of look like?
It's important that you need to distinguish, understand your organization, what the roles people are doing, and how they're going to contribute to a session like this. So, one of the key things you want to make sure, and I'll get around to directly answering this question, Cam, but just for some background on it, you want to make sure that the people you have involved are ones who are able to both understand the process and be able to think towards what the future state needs to be and look to build onto what are you trying to get to. They need to be able to make some degree of decisions in there, but your subject matter experts are the people who can really help drive things out and help you understand where you're at today and some direction on where you're going tomorrow. But it's the business process owners who really need to be accountable for making the decisions and being able to say, yes, this is absolutely what we want to do or not. And they're also responsible for setting direction. That comes from various directions, roles within the organization who are going to help with that. So if you need to make sure what are you trying to get out of this initiative. Are you trying to standardize your processes? Are you trying to bring together different locations onto something common? Are you trying to just aim for greater efficiency and have improvement in that way of meeting certain metrics around whether it's quality or time to complete, customer satisfaction? Obviously, everything's got to be linked towards your customers' goals in the end, but making sure that you are really clear on what the direction is and what you're trying to get to. So ultimately, it's the business process owner who needs to be accountable for that within. So they have a key role for sure in the before any changes are implemented in your processes, that they're the ones who need to be comfortable that that's the direction you want to go. The subject matter experts are the ones who can really help identify a lot of those things on the ground that you need to do. So just to tie it back to where you were coming from in your question, it really depends on what your skill sets are of your subject matter experts and your BPO, your business process owner. Are they going to add value sitting through this time and working through the mapping with people and defining everything, or are they best positioned to do a review after the fact and help set some direction based on those things that are found? And your subject matter experts, are they capable without the guidance in the room or with just from the facilitator to be able to set some of that direction and pick the future state? Or are you going to end up having a session where your SMEs are coming up with a bunch of ideas, but then you bring them over to your process owners later and find that these things are based on taking things from where we are today and improving them, as opposed to setting a new way of doing work that you want to get to. So you really need to have a clear understanding of where you're trying to get to and what your skill sets are of your people to be able to get there.
Excellent, thank you. And there was one thing you mentioned, it was initiatives, and I think this would be a good time to maybe link up process improvement to digital transformations. So what does that look like?
Absolutely. So, organizations, the term digital transformation, some may think of as a buzzword, and it can mean a lot of different things. It is to a degree, but it's a helpful umbrella in which to think about the impact of technology and what it has on our organizations and how you're trying to modernize and use technology to your advantage. And as I mentioned earlier, processes are not they're not your technology directly, but technology does have a big impact on things. So I like to I don't think of process as strictly it's driven by technology. It's your processes that really drive what your technology needs to be, and you need to align that, but the capabilities you get out of technology are important. So as you're looking into an effort where whatever kind of project you're doing or initiative you're undertaking that is connected to your business processes, those processes and your business or organizational goals are what you need to think about in terms of driving that forward. So if you're in the early stages of saying, for example, we want to get a new ERP system, we want to drive our organization forward and increase efficiencies in our supply chain, in our purchasing, in our manufacturing, in our finance, HR, whatever it is you're trying to improve there, you want to make sure that initiative and the technology you go with is aligned to where you want your processes to be. You don't just want to jump into, let's pick a technology and assume we're just going to latch on to whatever that technology has to offer, and our business will follow suit. That's a recipe for failure if you just assume the technology alone is going to make those changes. You may decide that you want to follow those, I hate to use this term, but it may apply here. There are some scenarios where just using best practice technology processes within a technology is the direction you want to go. But that needs to be a well thought out and considered decision where you're still understanding that some parts of your business may not fit into that. You need to understand really put the time and effort into what it is you're trying to do, and how is that going to drive the technology decision, and making sure that anything you're doing from a technology perspective is aligned around where does your business and your organization trying to go.
Excellent. I think the big driver there is the business drives technology, not the other way around. And so that was a great message. And I think that kind of rolls into, how does a company's future depend on process improvement, whether it's digital transformation initiatives or just generally business process management, which is a continuous process throughout the company's life. So how does this future depend on it?
Yes, it's critical. This is, of course, an interesting time to be doing this, as we're recording this in late March of 2020, and we know the world is undergoing fast changes. Organizations, they look different, very different in many ways now than they did a month ago, as we're dealing with the impacts of COVID-19 and what the stay-at-home measures and social distancing are doing for organizations and their customers and their businesses. It's a time of dramatic change, and this is looking at your process is one of the key things you can do around that to deal with this uncertain future. If you're in a place where your business is struggling as a result of a sudden downturn that's through no fault of your own, this is one of the things you can do, is look at your processes and see how they can be modified to meet the change in circumstances. Are there areas where you may have people that can be redeployed to doing things a little differently? Do you have the ability to roll out some new products or services that are central, close to what you do today, but may require some change in the way you work in order to operate? So these are things that are strategic goals, but the execution of that strategy is driven by processes. And so it's looking at your processes that can enable you to do that. You may be in a position today where suddenly, say if you're in a food business or a medical device type business, or something that's really stepping up in these times, you may need to then, you're dealing with influx of demand that you are not used to handling, and it may be driving out gaps in your processes that you haven't seen before, or maybe you've seen them and didn't think they were as impactful as now suddenly, as your volume increases and your expectations are higher and higher from your customers, that you need to take a look at these things and get them fixed now. So processes always enable you a mix of some quick win improvements, things you can step in and do now just by getting people together and taking a look at what you do, as well as driving strategic goals for the future and being able to align your organization around where you're trying to go. And again, I just want to tie it back to what I said earlier. This is that your processes are what connect your people to your customers, to your end goals. And so to Cameron's question about how does this impact your future, it's the business processes that are really at the ground floor of making things happen, and the execution on what you believe is important and what your strategy is. Your people are the key to that happening, but your people get work done through processes. So it's being able to have a good understanding of and an ability to make those, shape those processes around what you're trying to do. That's critical to surviving and stepping out above your competition to do what you need to do.
Excellent. And definitely, as things can slow down for some other industries, this might be the perfect time when they're having that remote workforce to bring people together and start focusing on these processes. It's something that you can do and something that's necessary. And without knowing the timeline of how long we're going to be on this, slow moving business trend for some industries, maybe we can, companies can try to enhance those processes. I would say, with everything we've discussed today in business process management, do you have any additional thoughts, comments that you'd like to add in general? Final thoughts for people watching, to key takeaways from this video?
Yeah, I think another thing I'd like to just drive home, and I've only made kind of indirect reference to it here, but it is that your people are so intermingled and directly connected to your processes that you can't think of processes as just sort of a mechanic technical exercise. And as you're making changes to your processes, recognizing that these have an impact on your people, the way they do work, and even, people have an identity of what they are as a worker. And if you're making changes to processes, that is something that can drastically change the way they view things and how they operate. So it's really important to make sure to continue to look at the people side of things. And as you're doing these processes, as you're implementing improvements, that you're looking at the impact to your people and undergoing organizational change management activities that are going to help you and help your people to adapt to any new realities that come about. And some of these things may seem small, but if people are used to a certain way of communicating and interacting with their coworkers, and that gets changed, and in some cases it may be, again, one we're seeing a lot today is remote work. Someone may have turned to the person behind them to hand off a paper every day, and now they have to do it remotely, and it may be more efficient and easier and more trackable to do it remotely, but you recognize there's a difference in the way people are connecting and getting work done and the way they think about it. So you can't just assume, just by saying this looks more efficient on paper, that it's going to happen that way. You have to think about the people aspect of it if you want to make sure you're achieving your goals out of this.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Brian, for joining me today. And thank you, everybody, for those who watched. We appreciate you taking the time. And we hope that if you have any questions or comments regarding this video, that you reach out, jump on the Third Stage website where you can inquire on these different videos that we're sending out. So thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you all who were watching today.
Thank you, Brian and Cameron. That was very helpful. Appreciate having you guys on the show, and hopefully that was a good conversation and helpful for the listeners as well. We're going to take a quick break and share some additional thoughts on the whole concept of business process management. After a quick break here, you're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Feeling blessed, never stressed. Got that sunshine on my Sunday best.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa again. So that was, what did you think of that conversation with Brian and Cameron?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because they made a great point that, businesses, really life is always changing, right? We're constantly in flux. And business process management, it doesn't just happen one time when you're about to, embark on a digital transformation journey. It's a continuous thing that you need to evaluate regardless of where you're at in your business, right? It's, something where you need to reassess if you've been doing the same thing for the past 3-4 years. It's time to look at it and make sure it's still efficient, it's still working. So I thought that was an interesting, kind of a common sense point, but something that maybe not everybody's doing. Obviously 2020 was a huge change, no matter what industry you were in, whether you were on, the side that your company maybe grew and saw demand, or your company kind of slowed down and got a little hurt. I mean, regardless of where you're at on the spectrum, 2020, even now, 2021, I imagine a lot of businesses have had to go through a formal process management evaluation.
Yeah, or they should, at least, if they haven't.
Or they should. Yeah, if they didn't, you should probably do it. If you're listening and haven't done it, now's the time.
Yeah, anytime you have a major change, if it's whether it's COVID related and you've had to change your entire operational model because of something like that, or you've gone out and acquired companies, or you've just grown as an organization, or you've entered a new market, taken on a new set of customers, that always puts pressure on your business processes. And a lot of companies don't really think proactively about, okay, what do we need to look like now that this change has happened? They sort of just, through tribal knowledge and organic change, just sort of adapt, which you need some of that. You need that flexibility and sort of organic on the fly adjustment, but you also want to be deliberate and strategic about your processes as well.
That's right. That's right. And I think one thing that relates to our last conversation with Dave is, again, bringing up the idea of testing. And Brian made the comment that just because a process seems efficient on paper, it doesn't mean that it's going to work that way in real life. So I guess my question is, when you're looking at, you're testing a software in the scenario with Dave. In this scenario, it might be something kind of intangible where it's literally just a workflow. So how would you go about testing a simple process change? Do you just implement it and then see if it works, and if it doesn't, you revert back? Or what's the best way to go about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a couple ways. I mean, first of all, if it's in the context of a new system or something you're going to formally roll out, obviously it's a little bit different because you can spend the time testing, as Dave mentioned or was talking about. But as far as if you're just making more of a continuous improvement type of scenario where you're just trying to get more optimization out of your current processes and systems, yeah, I mean, first of all, you want to define what you think it should be, and that involves mapping it out and defining the measures and the bottlenecks and all the things that go along with that. And there's a lot of tools from Lean Six Sigma. For those that are familiar with that, it's a process improvement and measurement sort of methodology and framework that provides a lot of tools and conceptual ways of dealing with business processes. But as far as how you roll it out, yeah, I mean, a lot of times it can be effective to sort of define what you want that process to look like and then roll it out to the organization, train people on it. If you need to make modifications to your technology, you do that. And so it ends up being sort of a more formalized rollout. That's how a lot of organizations will do it when they do it effectively. You could also do bits and pieces of it, but then you're just back to more the organic piecemeal approach versus I'm going to look holistically at my processes, look for the bottlenecks, look for where I'm underperforming, look for opportunities for improvement, or look for inefficiencies, whatever it is. You define all that up front, typically in the effective organizations, then you roll that out.
Yeah, because it could be something as simple as, just changing your point of contact or which team is going to own what responsibility or something. Yeah. Which seems like a small change, but it could really throw a wrench in things if you don't do it correctly.
Yeah, that's where the change management stuff, especially, or not especially, but in addition to the massive, digital transformation or formal business transformation projects, even just the ongoing improvements involve change management issues and communications and training and defining roles and responsibilities and doing the org design stuff. So it's a really good point. The change management is the common thread through all this.
Right. And I think the key takeaway from this is leaders shouldn't assume that their team is just going to adapt to these changes, whether it's a big change like completely changing your software, or it's a new manager that's running the team, or a new process that you're doing. I mean, any tweak in what people have been doing and what they're used to is going to create some type of wave, whether it's a big wave or a small wave. I guess it just depends, right? But I guess if there are leaders who maybe are overlooking organizational change management and not taking it as seriously with a smaller change like a process change, what is the repercussion of kind of neglecting OCM and how to help their team transition?
It just creates a lot of chaos, and it creates a lot of underperformance, and it creates just lost value. The value part of it's the one that is probably the easiest to quantify, because it affects dollars and cents. But the chaos that creates the impact on morale. I mean, you've got a lot of intangible impacts as well of not managing those changes effectively.
Right, that makes sense. It's important. Pay attention to OCM, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll hear us say it. You've already heard us say it many times on the show, and you'll hear us say it many times again. The change management is a critical component of any sort of change. So, well, good. Well, I appreciate you being on the show again this week, Paresa. Appreciate all of our guests listening in. Be sure to share this video, or share the podcast, however you're listening or watching, with your team, with your colleagues. We'd love to get the word out to more people just on some of the content we're sharing here with the audience. So, want to thank you all for joining. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.